Bardzes, dear Armenian friends and brothers and sisters. I'm really happy to be here. I wish I could address you in Armenian. We chose English as a language of communication. I'm happy to respond to questions also in Russian, but I think we might remain in English. It's not my first visit to Yerevan, and I do certainly hope that it's not my last visit, and the more I come here, the more I enjoy this country, about which we unfortunately don't know that much as Georgians. I think we probably know more about French politics right now than about Armenian politics, strangely. But hopefully this will change with the work of these two excellent foundations and a lot of people that have bridged the space between Georgia and Armenia. So the way I understand the objective of this talk is to present a narrative of political and legal changes in recent Georgian history, so that you pick up the experience that you consider most relevant and applicable to the current ongoing events in Armenian politics. So I might, in my talk or in my Q&A, I might say what I consider more relevant, what I think you would rather do or not do, but I think the best might be if I speak about relevant issues in Georgia, so that you draw whatever good and at the same time bad lessons that are there. And I'm sure that you have heard a lot about this breakthrough that we have had from the Rose Revolution later on. It's good things and bad things. All my Armenian friends have always been very excited. Oh, Georgia, look, it has modernized. And I was a skeptic at the time, saying, wait a minute, pay attention to other things. But whatever you have heard, at the moment I will try to present what I would call more of a balanced view of what happened. And the balanced view is because a lot of time has passed. And this is very important. And I was thinking today, probably the best time to evaluate what the revolution brought, what Armenian revolution brought, will be 10 years from now. That's when everybody will be much more objective. Because I personally went from the biggest supporter of the Georgian Rose Revolution in 2003 as a kid, into its biggest critics 3 years later, as I spearheaded one of the biggest critical campaigns against Saakashvili government. Then I left Georgia in 2007 because it was really hard to live there, and came back only after the government has changed in 2015. But from a sort of big supporter to a big critic, then I came to this balanced view of what happened, what good things were achieved, and what negative lessons could be drawn from there. So for the purpose of this talk, I would like to divide, and to make it easier for you, the recent history of Georgia into 3 periods. And I will only be concerned with last 2. I think it will make it easier for you. First one is the period of national state building from 90s to 2003. So in 90s, just like Armenia, 1991, 92, we receive a Georgian state, and basic work of state building is being done. But at the end of 90s and the beginning of 2000s, already the state was set up, but rampant with corruption, ineffective, territorial conflicts going on, and that's what we call, and I will refer to as Shevardnadze era. Right? Georgia is set up as an international actor. Shevardnadze garners great international reputation, but domestically, the state is corrupt, budgetary revenue is always in deficit, and we as Georgian citizens, and I tell this to my son who can't believe it, I told him, we used to get electricity once in 2 weeks, and of course he's a postmodern child, so he can't believe it, but that was the reality, right? So all of that huge discontent with the state of affairs leads to the Rose Revolution, and the period that comes after, that's 2003 to 2012. Approximately 9 years under Saakashvili, and that's the period I will be most concerned with in my talk. there is a lot of controversy on what we call now, historically, this period. Saakashvili and his party still has supporters in Georgia. It's not possible to discount them. And for them, this period is a great breakthrough. So he receives a failed state, and it becomes a viable state with no corruption, with rule of law, and so on and so forth. A group of critics would call it 9 bloody years. Yes. And there's a whole way to explain why, which I will. I present here more of a balanced view, and I think it is a breakthrough with a dark side. So undoubtedly, and I'll go into the reforms that took place from 2003 to 2004 and 5, 6, just to generate the following information. First, what is possible to be done after a revolution? What was done in a good and a bad sense at the same time? And when we received a legacy of the third period, 2012 to now, how did the government try to deal with the issues of justice and human rights violations that occurred before? So these are the two things. So let me start with a story of what kind of country we had in 2003. And this is to say that it's still very different from Armenia today. I mean, Armenia today is much more of a modern state than what we had in 2003, than Roma's revolution happened. So I have to tell you a story. When I started working at the Ministry of Defense, there are some old employees that have been there for a long time. And one of them is telling me that, you know, Anna, in 2002, the Ministry of Defense didn't have a copier, a copying machine. So they used to have an office of American military assistance right in the Ministry of Defense building, and Americans used to have a copying machine. So when the military needed to copy something, they used to ask for Americans, make copies.
Leave the copy.
Of course, leave the copy, inevitably, or leave the record of the copy. But that was just to describe the kind of state Saakashvili received in 2003. So I would say that's much worse in terms of challenges that the post-revolutionary government has in Armenia. So three main areas, but that are kind of similar. So state building, creation of not corrupt, viable, and competent civil service, development of economy, which was defunct, basically. If you paid taxes, you were an exception. If you paid an income tax or a profit tax, you were an exception. If you did not make bribes, you were an idiot. You were not an exception. You were just a fool. And the third was territorial integrity and the factor of Russia, right? So there's 3 areas. So the new government of young people with enormous support of 90-something% comes into power to deal with this mass. And of course the question was where to start. The reforms that took place in those 9 years were absolutely rapid. That's why it's a breakthrough, right? So if in normal circumstances, let's say one reform that impacted my life and the lives of our children is the reform of entrance exams for universities. Universities in Georgia also were very corrupt. You had to be a son or daughter of some influential person, or you had to be a tutoree of a professor, or you had to pay a bribe. When I passed my exams, I remember my classmates coming in with big boxes of tangerine, mandarini, because they were from villages and they had great crops, and they brought this as a bribe to the professor. So this one exam that Saakashvili government did, probably in normal speed, this one reform, in a normal setting would have taken 3 or 4 years, right? So you would have to have consultations, right? You would have to have stakeholders, you would have to have foreigners, you would have to consult with the public with the 3 drafts of the laws. In Georgia, this happened like this, with one hand movement of a hand, which of course, in all these areas which were improved, created a lot of resistance. Okay. So this university exams is one of the biggest legacies, achievements, but currently nobody can complain. They can complain about a lot of things, but there are no complaints that you can enter into a university without deserving it. Right? The other areas where improvements have happened were fight against corruption, fight against thieves in law, police reform, tax revenue reform, civil service reform on everything that relates to hiring new people, and no, just giving a chance to young people to enter into civil service. And basic infrastructure changes, so making water accessible, improving roads, improving bridges, making electricity accessible. So if this had happened in normal circumstances, with normal speed, with all the democratic and rule of law procedures, it would not be possible to do it in 9 years. Right? It would have been taken 30. Now, the cost of this, of course, was very high. One is everyday violations of rule of law. Every day, and the tactic was, okay, we have a law, we need to change the judges. Okay, what do? Change the law. Right, so in relation to everything, the tactic was, the procedures can wait, we have great aims or objectives to achieve. The cost there also was the fact that even if some things were done right, public was unhappy that, for instance, they needed to follow the rules in certain instances. Like a famous case that people have written about is seatbelts, right? I remember when they passed the very strict regulations in relation to wearing seatbelts in the cars, and Georgians were very unhappy. Arguments were such as, how about if I'm wearing a white shirt? This will ruin my white shirt. And all other ridiculous things for basic rule-bound behavior, right? So even if there would be people would be unhappy, even if things were done right, because the idea that there will be rules will be strict and they will be applied across the board, the idea was very unheard of and unusual. But biggest problem was, of course, not that people were annoyed, not that there were no consultations, not that civil society was initially involved, but later on, civil society kept saying unpleasant things, so they were no longer involved in consultations. None of them were as problematic as grave human rights violations, explaining which I think takes another lecture. Why did this happen? So why did this government turn into this path of running the country through violence? Right. It started right away in 2005 and 2006 with announcing the policy of zero tolerance, which in itself is not that dramatic. We might agree or disagree about it, but in itself is not that problematic. What's problematic that it was followed by the policy of, and clear statements by the president, if you are arresting a criminal and if you need to shoot him, shoot him. So, on paper, we see the rise of deaths during arrests. We see the rise of imprisonment rate, which doubled 4 times, right? So a lot of people that were discontent, of course, with the shrinking of bureaucracy, they ended up in the street or in prison. We see, of course, the cracking on dissidents and cracking on media, critical media. So at the end, in 2011, we had one tiny, small TV station, which was left broadcasting. The rest was just run by the government or government-affiliated companies. We see also, what's most interesting and dangerous, lots and lots of surveillance and creation of surveillance files. So the state has gone into the bedrooms of people, and this used to be a very basically a routine way of controlling people's behavior, blackmailing them with their private lives. And disbanding of peaceful protests. So we have had, like you have had here, we have had a couple of dates which are very important for Georgian memory. November 7th, it's like May 26th for us is like March 1st for you. Similar in terms of really cruel use of power. At the end, what happens? There's huge and growing discontent. Protest after protest, protest after protest, small, big, regional, central, results into a major protest movement linked to the leaking of videos of torture in prisons. And there's elections, and the protest vote is very active, and the government goes home. Peacefully hands power. That was the key, because this is in 2012, because there could have been bloodshed, but bloodshed would have been very big. So Saakashvili's party decided to hand in power peacefully. So the last chapter of the story begins. That is, the new government comes in, which, and this is relevant for you, I think, which was formed against the previous government. It didn't have its own ideology, left, wing, progressive, right. No, it was formed, put together by very brave people whose own main objective was to get rid of the previous government. It was so it was not an opposition that had its own agenda of reforms, right? So they come into power, and the question is, we have political prisoners, we have a lot of people in prison that probably shouldn't be there, thousands. We have a lot of people whose property had been taken, who had been racketeered. We have unfair judgments. What do we do? There were various proposals at the table, which can be explored. More of a broad proposal, which I favored at the time, and I still do, was some kind of a truth process. Right? Creating of a mechanism that would allow people to come forward, tell their story of victimhood, and create a historical narrative. This behavior is bad, and we're moving away from it. The government decided not to do this, for whatever reasons. So not like a South African process or Argentinian process. They said, we are going to stay away from this for various reasons, and I can explain later. The model that the government chose is the following, some of which might be useful here. First, the very first thing they did, making an official list of political prisoners. Either still in prison or released. So approximately 200 or something persons the parliament got together, and they created a list of political prisoners saying, these guys were in jail for political reasons. Their sentence doesn't have to do anything with justice. The problem in Georgia was that that's where the process stopped. I think the parliament should have gone, I think they will eventually, gone with compensations or some kind of form. So we have, for instance, a person who was in jail for 6 years. So, and nothing. The only thing she has is a title that she was a political prisoner. So that's one, making a list of political prisoners. Second, making a big amnesty. I don't think you need it here, but we needed it there because when Saakashvili started, we had approximately 7,000 prisoners. When he added, we had more than 30,000. And as one member of parliament told me, if we didn't pass the amnesty, the prisons would explode. So the moment Saakashvili left, there was huge demand for people who were arrested basically for stealing a can of beer to be released. So they released approximately 10,000 people. That was very brave. And the third one was individual prosecutions. Something similar that's going on here, I think, now. But here it's more corruption-based. There, in Georgia, it was more human rights violation-based. So, the former prime minister is in jail, he's serving a sentence. Former minister of defense is in jail serving a sentence. Former mayor of Tbilisi was in jail, he was serving a sentence for corruption. heads of prisons, individual heads of prisons who were involved, and prison guards, for a number of them. They're in jail for engaging in torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. So that's individual prosecutions. And the last thing, which is super interesting and which is kind of a Georgian know-how, is a department within the prosecutor's office, specifically dealing with restoration of justice department, was created. Now, background for that is the following. You see, the prosecutors that are in the prosecutor's office are the same. They're the same corrupt, non-rule of law bind, human rights oppressive prosecutors. So if you trust them to investigate the human rights violations that they themselves have committed, it's kind of strange, not to say it will not work. Plus, the public trust in prosecutor's office is very low, right? So there was a separate, I would call it like an island, a separate island created within the prosecutor's office as this restoration of justice department with new faces. So take young, new people that were not in the system, train them, very good lawyers, a new face to the department. People really like him. People don't like general prosecutor, but like this guy. That's very strange, who's on TV all the time. He's a little bit like, if you know, Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón. Check him. So he's like this figure for restoration of justice. So what this department does, which is a great thing with its own small problems, is based on individual complaints and based on the complaints by these political prisoners, they reopen cases. And of course, they can't reopen hundreds of cases. It's not possible, right? But if a person says, I was recognized as a political prisoner, or I think I was a political prisoner, here are the facts, here's my evidence, the judge didn't look at the minutes, at the records, there were no witnesses except policemen. This department looks at the evidence, basic evidence, and then makes a decision to reopen the case and takes it to the courts. Okay. So far, the only problem with this is it's slow, right? So we have been 2012, we have been 6 years after 2012, and the department dealt with maximum maybe 20, I don't want to be wrong, but it's not hundreds of cases, right? But they're doing this job very well, and I would say every case that's taken, everybody knew this was a political case, in a way, right? So they haven't made a mistake in terms of judgment. So the funny thing is that these cases then end up in the courts. They don't end up with the same judges, but they do end up with the same courts. And the court has come up and has acquitted, rehabilitated a lot of people who have been arrested for political reasons. So that's excellent for these people because at least they have a note, I didn't go for jail for nothing. I think the next step, or something that could be done here right away, is give these people some remedy. Right? In Georgia, they were left without a pecuniary remedy. Like, it's just, I'm sorry, the state did to you, you're a hero, you're going home. But their lives have been ruined. I mean, the lives of most of these people have been actually ruined. Because, their wives divorced them, or their families divorced them. The kids grew up God knows how. They couldn't pay their mortgages when they were in prison. So far, that's my big cause, to give them something, at least whatever, $500 a month as a pension. But so basically, that's a combination of remedies for transitional justice in Georgia, which is a mishmash of a lot of things, but it's kind of a step-by-step and a very incrementalist Georgian approach. I know that there were questions about civil society-government relations, but I'm happy to answer them a little bit later if there will be. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Amazing. I thought you were going to speak more about the first revolution, but you also talked about the situation after 2012, which I don't know how to call it. But So we should take lessons from two stories rather than from one. That's the first learning that I acquired. But I don't want, I want to move straight on to the questions. So I'll collect a few, like 3 by 3, and then ask you to answer. Okay? Please, go ahead. You will need a mic. So. And if you also say your name, maybe if you want your affiliation, that would be great for people to know where you're coming from. I think it worked. No? No?
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation. My name is Anna Dolidze. I work in a Open Society Foundations Armenia. And my question refers to the topic of political prisoners. You mentioned that a list of political prisoners was created. And if I understood it correctly, the list was created by the government. And if so, I have a question whether the creation of the list by the government is objective and whether it contributes to the justice, or some independent body should have created such a list, a judicial body or an independent new body. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Do you need a pen and paper?
No, so you want me to take questions down? I can.
I think it's better to have them collected. Any other questions? Please, I can give it to you. You just pass it.
I prefer to speak in Armenian.
One moment.
Երկու հարց ունեմ, Էդգար Վարդանյան, քաղաքական վերլուծաբան։ Նախ հետաքրքիր է իմանալ արդյոք Սաակաշվիլի կառավարությունը ուներ այդ transitional justice կոչվածի անցումային արտադրության կոնցեպցիա։ Ում ենք ներելու, ում ենք նստեցնելու, ինչ եւ այլն, այդ ամբողջ փիլիսոփայությունը մշակված էր նախապես թե ոչ, եւ երկրորդ հարցը Հայաստանում վերջերս բավականին այսպես հաճախ խոսվում է այն մասին, որ անհրաժեշտ է ուրեմն որոշակի կոմպենսացնող հարկ սահմանել, որով որ պետք է այն օլիգարխները, այն օրինախախտները, որոնք հարստացել են, ապօրինաբար իրենք պետք է այսպես որոշակի կերպով վերադարձնեն այդ գումարները եւ դրա փոխարեն պետությունը, այսպես ասենք, ճանաչում է նրանց սեփականության իրավունքը, նրանք ուղղակի դառնում են բիզնեսմեններ, նման ինչ-որ կոնցեպցիա, նման մոտեցում արդյոք եղել է Վրաստանում Սաակաշվիլի շրջանում։ Շնորհակալություն։
Շնորհակալություն։ Խնդրում եմ։
Thanks again for the presentation. I'm Dante Khachatyan, representing Open Society Foundations Armenia. And my question concerns the individual persecutions, which launched after ousting Saakashvili's government. I wonder what was the role of the civil society in forming the benchmarks upon which these persecutions were executed. What was the role of civil society, how the government decided on specific benchmarks, which gross human rights violations were taken into account for measuring which cases should be taken on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Dante. Now we have 3 people for questions. Please, Anna, you can go ahead.
Yes. So I will start with first question. Very, very interesting. List of political prisoners. It was not uncontroversial. First, the good part about it was that it had already been developed with Saakashvili government in power. NGOs, including, I believe, with the support of the Georgian Open Society Foundation. Various experts already sat down and they took the Amnesty International criteria or Council of Europe definition of political prisoner, and they already developed a list of political prisoners when the government was saying, these guys are crazy, we don't have political prisoners. So the basis of the list was there. The first thing that the government did, the parliament, they sat down and took that list as a working document and developed it further. Now this is very important because there was a controversy within who would get into the list and who wouldn't, and why some people got on the list, and that damaged the list itself, right? But not to the extent that it's invalid. It's just that some NGOs then left this process from the parliament because they disagreed with who ended up in the list of political prisoners. So it's really important for the process to be clean and transparent, even if the government does it. And it had two chapters: one, political prisoners, and second, political refugees, because some were persecuted and left abroad and lived abroad, and they wanted to come back, but their criminal cases were still open. So the prosecutor's office needed an official reason why to close a criminal case, right? And the other one was political prisoners who were in jail for political purposes. So the origin of the list was in civil society. So that's a good thing. The second one was a question of assets and corruption. So it's very important. We had, so Saakashvili government, when they started chasing former oligarchs and former corrupt ministers, first he had unbelievable support. I was a child and it was terrible to see all this. They were not only corrupt, they were terribly arrogant. And this combination is the worst. Probably you can be corrupt but not be arrogant, probably. I don't know. Maybe not. But these guys were just notoriously corrupt and notoriously arrogant, both. Because there was impunity, so they knew that they could get away with anything. So Saakashvili's agenda of chasing these people and basically taking away their assets had a lot of public support. But it was done, I think, with one trait which basically made people empathize with these oligarchs. Because in everything that the previous government did, they loved demonstrating power. So in one instance, we had a corrupt governor. Everybody knew he was corrupt. Well, rather, his assets couldn't match his income. And when they stormed into his house, people in Spetsnaz, Maskisho, when they stormed into his house, they dragged him out in his underwear. It was on TV. So took him out from the bed and dragged him out in underwear, like 10 cameras there. I think the agenda was there to instill fear of law enforcement, but it didn't serve a good purpose. Eventually, people's empathy came to the side of these bad guys. That happened to some oligarchs. One of them was tortured in prison and he passed away. Not an oligarch, but basically somebody who was allegedly corrupt. So that's one mistake, was disproportionate use of power. Second was kind of semi-legal or illegal way to take away their property, is they were giving gifts back to the state. So suddenly, a lot of people decided they were very generous and they needed to give their huge houses back to the state. And they did so. And so these houses are now in Tbilisi. There are some public buildings in there. And the third one was something that I think could be used here, is a totally legal way and could exist in any country, whether it's a staunch fight against corruption or not, is the law on unsubstantiated assets. We have this law right now, but for some reason the government isn't using it, the prosecutor's office isn't using it, and I don't like it. because I see very many mistakes where, a public official suddenly has a very expensive car, right? So questions need to be answered. But this law was put in place, and then the prosecutor's office could start a case in the courts against an individual for them to justify if they got this apartment from their babushka or from wherever. So that's actually, that's a good and very legitimate remedy, I think.
We have
But
similar law in Armenia. It's called a law in criminal code, it's written illicit enrichment.
yes.
We have a separate provision.
Yeah, and they have to substantiate how they got their car or whatever, yeah. So that's, I think that's three main methods how the property was returned. If I might recall others, but these are main three. And the third, and civil society, yes, and prosecutions. So there I am a little bit divided, because when this current government started prosecuting, let's say, former prime minister for abuse of power for disbanding a peaceful demonstration, there was a lot of criticism, some well substantiated procedural issues. I don't think the international organizations played a good role, because in messages from EU came, for instance, that don't look back for the past, look for the future. This is selective justice. While I have written about this, while domestically there was incredible need to put these people to accountability, right? Right. And I think the problem wasn't that this person was a former prime minister. The problem was that he was, from my perspective, right, he was at least implicated in this peaceful dispersal of a peaceful demonstration, in a violent dispersal of peaceful demonstration. But when one government does it to another, you have to pay incredible attention to procedures, so that it's not perceived as political. In this case, things were done in a very clumsy way, and so we have a bad judgment from the ECHR, bad judgment for the government, right? So this is highly sensitive. Of course, it's the next government prosecuting the previous one. I would say, at the time I argued against, I would say that you have to, if there will be international, back off, healing, reconciliation, look for the future, I think you have to explain that for rule of law and justice, you need to do these things. But you have to prosecute them based on law, because if you don't do it well, you will have the kind of sense of impunity that we have right now, right, in Georgia. So you have to do it. You have to do it, but you have to do it well. That's my personal opinion.
Okay. Thank you very much. We can have another round of questions. If people have ready-made questions, Edgar has another one. Is the microphone close? It's again in Armenian.
Շնորհակալություն։
Just one second.
Հետաքրքիր է իմանալ արդյոք Շևարդնաձեի ժամանակաշրջանի քաղաքական գործիչներից որևէ մեկը ներողություն խնդրել է այն բանի համար, որ խախտել է մարդու իրավունքները, հակաժողովրդավարական վարք է դրսևորել եւ այլն։ Եվ ընդհանրապես արդյոք Սաակաշվիլի շրջանում այդ transitional justice-ի շրջանակներում դրված էր նման խնդիր ստանալ նախկին իշխանավորների ներողությունը եւ ինչ որ կերպ հնարավորություն տալ նրանց ապաշխարել եւ միգուցե դա հիմք կծառայեր, որպեսզի իրենք ներվեին, հա, եւ հետագայում այսպես համերաշխ ապրեին։ Շնորհակալություն։
Շնորհակալություն. Please here and then
I'm sorry, I'm not that familiar with Georgian history, but it seems to me that Saakashvili did an important job in fighting corruption, even though, as you mentioned, in the end, he did a lot of violations of human rights. But I think probably the population, I wonder if the population became discontent not only of the violations of human rights, but also the fact that the economic reforms were not as strong or forceful, and the discontent was coupled with that as well. In other words, their well-being, their standard of living did not improve very much, and therefore the discontent, the violations became much more annoying to the population. And
Thank you.
I'm curious about salary rises for civil servants, how you tackled this challenge. At the beginning we heard that it was OSI who was just funding, and then it was Ivanishvili's interview that he said that he was the funder. How this system worked, because there was rise, but GDP per capita, it wasn't that big. There wasn't that big difference between Armenia and Georgia. How was the gap between civil servants and ordinary people with low salaries?
Thank you. I think you can go with it.
Yes, thank you. So I'll start with apology. It's very, very important, and we need some anthropologists for this, I think.
Or psychologists.
Or psychologists. Because apology in Georgian culture is not practiced. Right? It's not practiced. I would like to see a good ethnographic work on why. Because there probably are forms of apology, just not what we expect. Right? I mean, I have to think about it. But in general, biggest problem of Saakashvili in general was that he never recognized any of his mistakes. Right? Pressing. If he had said, this would be brilliant, if he had said what he says now, oh, this case was my big mistake. He frequently says that. If he had said that, you know, that would actually give him some points. So even if those former oligarchs were given space to apologize, I don't think they would. It's rare. So we can count on hands how many people have publicly apologized in Georgia. Whether you take, a small controversy or a big scandal. Anyway, it's very unusual. What happened was that once they got scared, they started either giving away assets or their assets were taken away. But I don't recall a single person coming out and saying, we made a mistake. No, and the problem was that they were terribly arrogant. Right? So it's hard to make that sudden transformation into a humble person. So that's one. Second is, I want to say something about the salary rises. I think that's very important because if you imagine, I was a deputy minister of defense, right? And I've seen contracts for from $1 million to $20 million. Right? So if this person is not paid enough, that the temptation is too big. Even with this possibility of jail, you can think that, my children will for sure go to Harvard. I'll go to jail for 2 years or something, but my children will definitely go to Harvard or something, right? So you have to have decent salaries. So what happened in 2003 and 2004? Suddenly government salaries were much higher than NGOs. So when NGO workers left for government, one was ideological, definitely. It was very exciting. So I worked for the NGO, right? I was the chair of Big Watchdog, and we kept doing the same thing. And suddenly there was this interesting stuff going on in the government, reforms, anti-corruption, so a lot of young people left. Coupled with that, they started offering very competitive salary. So we lost brain power. NGOs lost brain power, which at the time I didn't think was drastic, because actually the government had a challenge. They needed new people, but from where on earth would they bring new and competent people? I mean, where? It's just 4 million people. We don't even have diaspora. You guys have diaspora. We don't have diaspora, or our diaspora is very small. Okay, so where should you bring people? So a lot of, it has happened with me when the Prosecutor General, who was an NGO guy before, and who turned into a villain later, 10 years later, he's a villain. He came to me and said, Anna, now you give us a list of best of your workers. And my organization had 120 lawyers at the time. And we did. We sent him a list of 15 bright guys. And actually we ruined their life with that, actually. Because they worked out very tough jobs in very unpleasant contexts. So that's part of their career. But at the time it was super. They were the luckiest people they turned around. Because so exciting. So in terms of salaries, the salaries were raised. Initially it was through various contributions to this foundation. They were raised from $50 a month to $500, approximately. So currently, and I was asking this currently, the very basic salary for the most entry-level civil servant employee is approximately $500. And the salaries of ministers, deputy ministers, judges, they're quite decent, right? So initially this is how it happened, but then they tightened up the revenue service. First 2 years, they made people pay their taxes, including businesses, so they started paying from there. But it's not just that, the second one is selection procedures. For the first time, if you didn't have a patroning, you could start working in a public service. For the first time, right? So we started interviewing basically people with a university diploma. Before that, you had to have an ATOL. So these two things, right? Getting new people, competent people, and second, making sure that they earn enough. But I think the question of discontent. Not so much economic development, because economy was very vibrant. Very vibrant. A lot of money was coming in, and most importantly, a lot of money was spent. So all of those infrastructure projects was public money spent, right? So it's this kind of, Great Depression model, New Deal model. The problem was lack of distribution, right? You had that, so you had new hotels coming up, Radisson, Marriott, and then you had a kid stealing, I worked on this case, stealing 2 bottles of beer and going to prison because of this. So that lack of distribution. And second, Saakashvili, yes, as a miracle, got rid of large-scale corruption. But basically 5 people controlled the whole economy. Yeah. So there was concentrated corruption at the top. 5 individuals controlled the whole economy, including this Prosecutor General. So at the end, initially, I have this phrase, immediately after revolution, everybody flies an economy class. It's fashionable. You make a revolution, and I met President Saakashvili in an airplane on the economy class. And I was shocked. I was like, Minister of Justice on an airplane with me. Because before that, of course, you could never see them. It was all private, all first class. But then it was all corrupted. So lavish parties, lavish dinners, lavish visits, back and forth, lavish spendings, only personally, right? And that caused a lot of sense of injustice and kind of this bad feeling. I wonder what would have happened if they have been harsh, but not personally corrupt. So if they would have stayed clean, but their methods would have been the same. I don't know what happened, if people would be just as angry as they do.
My question related to civil society organization and as a continuation to what you presented to us. After the, let's say, revolution, it was considered that working for the new government is a privilege, and new government used the potential and capacity of the CSO organizations. I would like to know how the CSOs handled this, let's say, crisis in terms of expertise and capacity that he lost. And do you consider that the degradation was reasoned by the weakening of the civil society organization and loss of public control and civic control and public oversight? Was in your assessment, was it conditioned by the weakening of CSO field?
Thank you.
Merci. Վարդես Գասպարի, ուրեմն ես երկու հարց ունեմ, sorry to speak in Armenian. Ուրեմն առաջին հարց. Առաջին հարց, ուրեմն մենք ես ուրեմն վերջին 1-2 տարում եմ Վրաստանում ավելի շատ լինում եւ իմ տպավորությունն եմ ուզում ասել ու ձեզ խնդրում եմ, որ հաստատել կամ ձեր գնահատականը, որ որքանով էին տպավորությունը ճիշտ։ Ուրեմն առաջինը դա, որ ես հիմա վերջին 1 տարում, որ շփվում եմ Վրաստանում, խոսքը վերաբերում է փողոցի մարդկանց հետ, ոչ միայն բիզնես մարդկանց հետ։ Վրացի տղամարդիկ հատկապես շատ բարեկիրթ են, իմ գնահատմամբ, ասենք մեր հայաստանցիների հետ համեմատած։ Եվ լսել եմ, որ նախկինում մի 10 տարի առաջ, Վրաստանի Սաակաշվիլից առաջ, եղել են շատ ավելի անբարեկիրթ, քան հայաստանցիները, շատ ավելի կրիմինալ psychologic բանով, հոգեբանությամբ և բանով, մշակույթով։ Եվ այդպիսի մեծ փոփոխություն է տեղի ունեցել, արդյոք դա իրականությունը համապատասխանում է թե ոչ, առաջին հարցս է դա, և եթե այդպիսին է, ապա ոնց է տեղի ունեցել, ոնց պատահեց դա։ Երկրորդ հարցը ուրեմն իմը հետևյալն է, որ ուրեմն կրիմինալից ձերբազատվելու ճանապարհին, որքան ես հետաքրքրվել եմ, դա տեղի է ունեցել կտանքներով, խոշտանգումներով, բանտերում, կրիմինալ խավի նկատմամբ։ Արդյոք դա այդպես է միանշանակ ձեր կարծիքը, ձեր ինֆորմացիան, և եթե այո, ապա այլ ճանապարհ կար այս կարճ ժամանակում կրիմինալից այդպես արագ ձերբազատվել։ Շնորհակալ եմ։
Շնորհակալություն, խնդրեմ երրորդ դեպքը ձեզ հնարավորություն տանք, հետո
Good evening, my name is Rebecca. I'm a student of Sciences Po Strasbourg. So I have a question about Georgian identity. So first of all, I would like to ask if there is such a concept that is called Georgian identity, and how would you construct it? And second of all, to what extent the Rose Revolution perpetuated some form of Georgian identity, and also vis-à-vis its national minorities that are quite distinctively present in Georgia. Thank you.
How do you pronounce those?
Well, if you can take 4, I will ask one more person. Please, Harry, please.
It's me. Իմ հարցը վերաբերում է առաջին անցումային արտադրությունը, եթե ես
բաց թողեցի ձեր խոսքում դուք նշեցիք ներողություն եմ խնդրում, բայց ուզում եմ հասկանալ, Վրաստանում անցումային արտահայտությունը տեղի ունեցավ տեղափոխությունից հետո այդպես հախորը նստածս, թե դրա վերաբերյալ խորհրդարանը կամ կառավարությունը ընդունեց որևէ իրավական ակտ, եւ երկրորդ հարցը կոռուպցիայի դեմ պայքարում, եթե իմ ընկալումը սխալ է խնդրում ինձ ուղղել, թվացյալ պատկերացում գոնե կար, որ մարդիկ, սովորական քաղաքացիները այնքան էլ չողջունեցին գոնե ստորին ուղարկներում կոռուպցիայի դեմ պայքարը, որովհետև կա ձեռնտու կոռուպցիա հասկացությունը եւ իրենք շատ հարցեր փորձում են լուծել ծանոթությունների կամ մանր կոռուպցիայի միջոցով, որը իրենց կարծիքով կոռուպցիա չէ, ես իմ անձնական դիտարկումներից եւ շփումներից եմ դա ասում տարբեր մարդկանց հետ, որոնք ուղղակի դժգոհում են, որ սովորական կենցաղային խնդիրների լուծումը սկսած քաղաքաշինությունից մինչև հողի խնդիր, նրանք ստիպված են բարդ մեխանիզմներ հաղթահարել, փոխարենը կարող են ուղղակի ծանոթով կամ հայերենում ասում են վերաբերմունք, վերացերնու չգիտեմ ինչպես են ասում, որը կաշառք չի ընկալվում, բայց ամեն դեպքում հովանավորչություն է, շնորհակալություն։
Շնորհակալություն։ I think you have a package of questions.
So I would say, yes, okay. So I would start with, from the end, perhaps, corruption. So I think corruption was dealt in Georgia in a very sophisticated and multifaceted way. Not only through zero tolerance, which meant that, for instance, I met a policeman who was served a sentence for accepting a 20 lari bribe. This is a $7 bribe. Full sentence. So that's a tough criminal prosecution, but also changing the systems. So there's is a recipe. So there is no space for corruption. So reducing bureaucracy, and one of the best examples for that is a civil registration system. It works much better in Tbilisi than in New York, I can tell you. In Brooklyn, when you go there, you have to stay one day, God knows where. In Georgia, depends how much you pay, it's like mathematics. So it's both. So institutionally, they dealt with it so that everything became simpler. Land registration happens in 1 hour. This is the key, I think, also for economy. 1 hour. You have a contract, notary, go register it in the public service. There, you get a number and it will be solved. Right? So transactions can go on very fast. So they dealt it with both two ways. And the third one, which I think is very important, is hyperactive public relations. At the time, we were laughing at this because President Saakashvili liked to be on every TV at the same time. But for this breaking of this criminal attitude, it was very important. So there was a big public campaign, and the campaign wasn't a small change. It was a change from a routine way of doing your business, paying a bribe, to this being not acceptable, right? But it succeeded. So I think I would say this combination of three: tougher sanctions and enforcement, campaigning, and third is institutional reform. Now on, so I would say, I wouldn't say there was resistance to fighting corruption at all. No, because corruption was actually a real burden for regular people, because you had to pay something, and on top of that you had to pay a bribe of $5 or something. Okay, the next question was on criminal mindset. That's a very tough question, because also the big dilemma was coming from a society when, seriously, following a law is uncool, right? It's not reversed, that following law is cool and not following is uncool. No. Georgian society in 2000 was following the law, you are nuts. You are crazy or dumb, idiot. You're dumb if you follow the law. You know who, all these people who are some strange professors somewhere, they follow the law. Most people, if you can not follow the law, you will not follow the law. So imagine fighting that and coming to a society where people of my age just don't know how to accept a bribe. Don't know. Even if somebody brought me, a big case of thousands of dollars, I wouldn't know what to do. Right? So it's a huge... You can tell me. Okay. So it's a huge breakthrough. At top of this pyramid were, of course, vory v zakonie. I mean, these are, on my opinion, seriously bad guys. Not only themselves, but because they had whole adherents and they were involved in schools, in villages, municipalities, of raising future generations of their victims, who believed that not following the law was cool. Right? And of course, when I started my work, for example, when we used to go into prisons, you had cells for vory v zakonie, and you had normal poor prisoners. And these guys had a telephone, had TV, had a big sofa. So all of that was gone. But the government undoubtedly went beyond that. I think the thinking there was the following. You know an expression, prison is a home for a thief in law. So I think, what I have observed, the government thought, if we take these thugs and put them to jail, even if they're not very comfortable, they will still run the system. So they thought of increasing the cost of going to jail. And the idea of going to jail became horrific, right? There was because everybody knew that, for instance, if you went to jail, first you had to go through this corridor, which meant you were beaten up like hell. Every inmate, right? So this was probably the idea how in general torture started to be used on certain individuals, and then on a lot of people, including political prisoners, right? But this is my explanation of why torture emerged, and the key explanation there is, if you use it once, if you allow it to be used once, then it ends up being a practice, because you end up covering it up, so it's de facto allowed. Criminal mindset and Georgian identity. Yes, that's excellent. Well, there's a great Georgian... No, I won't go into poetry, but I think my position on this is Georgian identity is defined by its location. We are the westernmost of the East and the easternmost of the West.
I thought that's us.
Oh, yes, exactly. Well, there are historic centuries-long arguments about this. Yes. So I think our identity is always defined of how liberal we are, or how Christian we are towards the East, or then how conservative and how non-Western and non-European we are towards Europe. And I think that's Georgian. Therefore, it's always in flux and not fixed, and I admire it that way, I have to say.
Thank you very much. I hope Maria and you will not continue arguing who is more non-Western and non-Eastern, but that would be typical for Armenians and Georgians. Try to divide something. There was we still have another group of questions, but you asked too many, so maybe somebody else. Or you can comment.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really very interesting. Yes, thank you.
Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. So now for the most important question of the evening. How did you manage to have more women in government? Was it the result of the revolution? Did the revolution help in changing mentality, culture shift? Because it seems, if we compare it a little bit, as also you mentioned in the introduction, there are some power positions where women are not there in Armenia still.
And even though we have a new young government, who most of them are coming also from civil society background, well aware about human rights, gender equality, etc., we still have this, how do you say it, we're still stuck in this mentality that it's not really a serious issue to have more women, or it's not a priority, or it's not our job to encourage more women. The floor is open, and if they want to run and be part of it, they should do it. So I'm interested to understand, how did you manage to change that in your reality, and to have more women involved, both in parliament, government, power places, etc., even though we have some common mentality and values. And because to give you a perspective, in Armenia we have now this new government who is not corrupt, more leading towards human rights, rule of law, looking much better in general, smiling more, but still it's a group of men leading, you know, patriarchal and looking much better than the older corrupt ones, but less arrogant as well. So we'd be interested to see your experiences. Is there hope, or we need to have another revolution for that?
Thank you. You wanted to say something, no? You decided to. Since there is no other. Okay. Please. And then
Anna, I have again a few quick questions about transitional justice. I'm Maria from the Imagine Center. If I understand it right, there was never an official transitional justice mechanism implemented in Georgia. No government passed a law, etc. So I'm going to revert to the questions that are usually challenging me when I'm trying to advocate for transitional justice in our context. There is this argument that transitional justice is applicable when you have a change in the entire legal system of the country. Like, for example, in South Africa, you had apartheid and then the entire legal system changed. In our cases, what was illegal then is illegal now, so we should continue on with the regular justice system. What's your opinion on this when we don't really have a plague? And then when the government adopts this approach of no intervention into the justice branch of power, how do you implement transitional justice? Should you abolish this principle in order to implement, like what happens? The government passes a law intervening into the legal branch of power, and then another issue of concern for Armenia for transitional justice is how you define the period to which it's applicable. Can transitional justice be applicable to, let's say, the case of the capture of the police station that summer, or March 1, or should we go back as far as 1999, or the election fraud, could that go under transitional justice? And then the last part of my question, do you think this mechanism, if applicable within the internal legal system of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, could ever also lead to its application in the conflict context in order for Georgian Abkhaz reconciliation, Georgian Osset reconciliation, Armenian Azerbaijan reconciliation?
thank you. I think. Okay. Let's have that one in Armenian.
And my last question in Armenian also. Այնուամենայնիվ, որն է հիմնական պատճառը, որ Սաակաշվիլիի կառավարությունը շեղվեց ժողովրդավարական պետություն կառուցելու ուղուց։ Մարդիկ էին այստեղ խնդիրը, միգուցե մարդկանց քաղաքական մշակույթը դեռևս չէր փոխվել, միգուցե կար այդտեղ չարամտություն, միգուցե թվում էր սկզբից, որ այդ մարդիկ ժողովրդավարական արժեքներ կրող են, բայց հետո պարզվեց, որ ոչ, այդպիսին չեն, որն է հիմնական խնդիրը։ Միգուցե գայթակղության իշխանության չդիմացան։
Thank you.
Yes. So I will start with what do we have? Gender. No, gender. That's the most important question. Yes. So it's an interesting question because last decade we basically had a feminist revolution. Absolutely strange. In 2011, I wrote a dramatic letter saying we don't have a gender movement, it's terrible, nothing is going on, women are not defending their rights like this. And now we have a very vibrant, very strong and very massive women's movement. Now the key and the kind of cultural changes that happened are, for instance, when in 2006 I was on TV once, there was another politician next to me who said, well, women have just different kind of brains. And 2006. And you know, what do you expect? They're just not as capable. And you know what happened? Nothing happened to the statement. It just went, because there were tons like this. Now, there's still such thinking. There's still such attitudes. No Georgians haven't been switched. They're still the same people. Many people still believe it, but if somebody said that publicly on TV, they would be crucified in social media. There is enough of concentrated power in groups and mobilization in women to instill some cultural change. I think right now we are we're even discussing the quota system. It hasn't been passed, but at least it's on the table. I myself participated in drafting a law in 2006 on domestic violence when we brought in the idea of restraining order. I don't know if you have it here in our minutes. Yes. So when we passed it, everybody was saying, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about? This is something American. Nobody's going to call police, so on and so forth. So compared to that now, you know, it's not a point of pride, but the spike in statistics is like this, in police calls, right? So we are definitely not where we want to be, because there are instances of violence every day, right? But there has been this drastic change. One, first of all, it's acceptable to talk about this. And second, the gender critique is somehow permeating a mainstream era. So if that comment, look, it's just guys at the conference, would not be heard of 10 years ago. Nobody paid attention to it, except three women NGOs. It's more and more permeating public discourse. I think the biggest determinant is more women with economic power. In general, it's economic. And second, women's movement, the core of women's movement have been formed, and they organize like hell. They organize quickly, and it's all through social media, right? So our statistics, you know, they're not brilliant. We actually, what's the percentage? You know, you might know, what's the percentage of women MPs now?
11. It's even less than in former times.
It's less than, yes. So there are some heads of committees. There are definitely a lot of women in public sphere, but the problems remain. Unequal pay, lack of care, and all these things, these problems remain. Women, in terms of women in government, not at all. Now we have, I think, only one minister. Only one minister. We used to have more. And one by one, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, they left. We have one woman minister left. So we have a lot of women spokespeople and opinion makers, I would say. But in terms of their representation, or women mayors, I think the number is close to zero, maybe one or two. So it's not that. It's better, much better than what it was, but far from what we would desire. Then we had a question about judges and transitional justice. It's very important. So Georgian government decided not to touch this issue. There are no official explanations for why. Unofficial, where it's a small country, everybody knows everybody, and we shouldn't engage in blaming and so on and so forth. In fact, I wanted a truth process, because remember me 5 years from now. At the time when this change happened, everybody knew supposedly what's black and white. 5 years from now, you will have people who will say, wait a minute, all times were not that bad, right? Things were not that bad. You think I did something? No, maybe I was a minister, but I was a decent guy. So things will change and waters will become murky. And that's dangerous, because that allows for the return of the methods of work that you got rid of before. So in the Georgian context, I wanted transitional justice as a truth process, so kind of South African process. Just have smart people with respect write a narrative of what happened and why we didn't like the past, right? And have it and teach it in schools, so make sure it's written, right? Because what we have right now is half of the people of the former government are in the new government. A lot of people are saying, well, this wasn't bad, there were some tortures, but in fact it wasn't that massive, but yet you see we built these bridges. So waters became much more murky. So it would have been better if there was a narrative, okay, these practices were bad, we condemn them as a nation, therefore we are committed not to repeating them, right? Yeah, I think that's the value. The same about judges. All of our judges are left intact. Most of them are from the old system, which means they're used to the telephone justice. They're still in the courts. So it's possible that just as the previous government used them, the next one will too. Right? And the last question on why Saakashvili diverted, I don't know. I think that would take volumes of explanation. From the discourse, from the early ages of that government, I got a feeling at the time that they had decided to be historical, that they were going to do historical things. And he often quoted Erdogan and Atatürk and Lee Kuan Yew as having done historical breakthroughs. And second, that they had thought they would be in power for many more years than just the democratic cycle. So from there, I could deduce that the plan was there, it's a revolutionary power, and we will be here for a long time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anna?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I've heard many friends of mine speaking about the situation in Georgia, and I should say that yours is one of the most indeed balanced and in a way the presentation is full of wisdom, because to refrain from thinking why did Saakashvili become what he become is wisdom, I think. Yeah, but all of the stuff that you said, I think we have got a lot of food for thought. So we already uploaded once. I think we can upload one more for Anna, and then just go for the next one. Thank you very much.